Feel free to come closer if you like. I know, but I have this microphone here so you can hear me. So welcome to NOMA. As many of you probably know, downstairs we have staged, for the first time, a major fashion exhibition here at NOMA, A Queen Within, Adorned Archetypes. So hopefully you've had a chance to check it out, but if not, I encourage you to head down there afterwards. So the main thesis or argument of the show, A Queen Within, Adorned Archetypes. Can you hear me? Okay, well come around this way so you can be in your speaker. But the main thesis of the show, A Queen Within, Adorned Archetypes, is exploring facets or aspects of femininity through fashion. So avant-garde, contemporary, bold, experimental fashion as a way of expressing or experimenting with identity. And as we know, right, with contemporary fashion, this can be a very powerful way of pushing boundaries, right? Pushing the literal, physical boundaries of the body, but also the boundaries imposed by society or culture. So my idea for today is to explore the ideas which are expressed in that special exhibition downstairs as they relate to an object in our permanent collection. Another queen, in my opinion, the queen of NOMA, Marie Antoinette, and our portrait of her by Elizabeth Vigée-Lebrun, an 18th century portrait artist. So we're a big crew, but my idea is to start here, talk a little bit about my ideas for exploring this particular portrait today, and then if you'll follow me around the corner to our 18th century French gallery, and we'll spend most of our time there. So as you probably know, Marie Antoinette was the Queen of France from 1774 until the French Revolution, during which time she was beheaded in 1793. And Marie Antoinette, of course, is well known for her love of fashion and big hair, but that interest, right, her own love of fashion, is often portrayed in this sort of excessive and frivolous way, right? And that vanity and that excess is probably best summarized by this famous quote, "Let them have cake," right? Let them eat cake. We now know that that quote, right, "Let them have cake," in response to reports of starvation and poverty throughout France, which really ultimately led to the French Revolution, we now know that Marie Antoinette never actually said that. In fact, that quote comes from a Rousseau novel, which predates Marie Antoinette's arrival in France by about 20 years. But nonetheless, that quote has come to sort of represent her reputation, right? This sort of frivolous, vain woman who just loved fashion and cake, right? And that reputation, I think, has been expressed most recently and quite beautifully in the film Marie Antoinette by Sofia Coppola, in which Kirsten Dunst plays the ill-fated queen. And if you haven't seen that film, which is one of my favorites, we're actually showing it here at NOMA next week on Friday the 13th in our sculpture garden. So I encourage you to return and see the film again, or for the first time if you haven't seen it. But scholars, art historians, and historians who study Marie Antoinette and have read her letters and those of the people around her, have begun to sort of make more subtle or undermine that reputation, that sort of reputation of a frivolous woman who's only interested in fashion in sort of vain ways. And we actually think that now she used fashion, clothing, hair, shoes, in really kind of strategic and politically savvy ways. So my goal for today is to sort of explore how Marie Antoinette used fashion quite specifically through her portraiture, through representations of herself, which were exhibited publicly in the 18th century. And also, I think, of interest to me, I'm interested in female artists and female collaboration during the 18th century. Embedded in this portrait is the story, actually, of three women. Marie Antoinette, the queen, her preferred portraitist, Elizabeth Vigée-Lebrun, the artist of the portrait, but also her stylist, Rose Benton. So if you'll allow me, I'll talk a little bit about each of those three women in front of the portrait itself in our French 18th century galleries, if you follow me. And this is a big group, but feel free, please, to interrupt me, raise your hand, ask questions, comments, whatever, and we'll have time, of course, for questions at the end as well. Okay? So we're gonna head this way. So you can really have a good look. You guys want to step even closer so people can get close behind you? Perfect. Good. Okay. So as I said, really embedded in this portrait is the story of three women. Marie Antoinette, who you see represented, Vigée Lebrun, who is the artist, and Rose Benton, who is one of the major fashion collaborators with Marie Antoinette during the 18th century. So I'm going to talk briefly about each of those three women, and then again, of course, feel free to interrupt as I go. But Marie Antoinette was an Austrian princess. She was born in Vienna to the Empress Maria Theresa, who was an incredibly powerful and herself a very politically savvy woman. And Maria Theresa, who's the Empress of Austria, collaborated with Louis XV to marry their descendants. Right? So Marie Antoinette was the 15th child of Maria Theresa, and she arranged to have Marie Antoinette marry the future Louis XVI, who at that time was 15 years old. Sorry?
She wasn't first choice.
There were several daughters before her, that's true, yes. But she said she wasn't the first choice. And Marie Antoinette was a very pretty little girl, but she was only 13, 14 at the time that the negotiations for the marriage were taking place. But the arrangements are settled upon between the Empress of Austria and the King of France. And this Austrian princess is essentially shipped to Versailles when she's 14 years old. And this marriage was essential politically, economically, and militaristically between Austria and France. And the success of the marriage, right, was incredibly important to peace between those two countries. And this relationship was relatively new, this alliance was relatively new, so it was essential that the marriage go well. It didn't. So when she arrives at the age of 14, 15, immediately there's this sense of tension and awkwardness between the two preteens, as you can imagine. And we know that for the first 7 years of the marriage, it remained unconsummated. You might be thinking that's an incredibly intimate detail for us to know as historians looking back at the 18th century, but in fact, this was very much a matter of state business, and everyone knew. So for 7 years, everyone at court knew that they weren't sharing a bed. And of course, this was a matter of great controversy and scandal within the French court at Versailles, but we also have ample evidence of letters between Marie Antoinette and her mother, the Empress of Austria, encouraging her to get it on. Right? And this was essential not only for the success of the marriage, but also, as you can imagine, to produce an heir, right? To produce a future king of France. Right? So it's in the context of this incredible pressure, right? That Marie Antoinette's body is very much at the center of that controversy and that scandal, and the reproductive function of her body was very much a matter of politics, international politics. So biographers and critics, even within Marie Antoinette's time, suggest that she develops this kind of quote-unquote frivolous interest in fashion as a way of compensating or distracting herself from the sort of essential failure for the first 7 years of her marriage, that she sort of just distracts herself with clothes, essentially, and spends money in a way that she can't really fulfill her other functions as the future Queen of France. But I want to posit a sort of another secondary argument here, which is that she was essentially attempting to reclaim her own body. Right? This is how I dress myself. This is mine. In a time when her body was very much not her own. We know, of course, too, that part of the sort of ceremonial ritual of Versailles was dressing the king and queen every morning. And this ritual was actually established in the 17th century by Louis XIV, who is credited with building the Palace of Versailles and moving the entire court from Paris to Versailles. And so Louis XIV establishes this ritual every morning. The entire court, or the most privileged members of the court, gather to watch and assist Louis XIV in getting dressed. Right? So getting dressed and dressing the king's body or the queen's body was very much a part of the daily ceremony of being king or queen. And if you turn your attention to another portrait on this wall here, you see Marie Antoinette's husband, Louis XVI, wearing the sort of ceremonial garb of the king, which actually didn't differ all that much from that of his great-great-great-grandfather, Louis XIV. And we see this very traditional iconography of kingship, with this sort of ermine white fur cape, this red velvet robes, these sort of frilly lace cuffs, the white stockings. All of these are sort of very traditional of the Bourbon kings in the 18th century. This is not fashion, right? This is what kings wear. By contrast, Marie Antoinette's portraits are about contemporary fashion. She's wearing things that are of the moment, right? Not traditional at all. Okay? And we know that Marie Antoinette actually employed a veritable army or sort of small staff at Versailles, which was dedicated entirely to building and maintaining her wardrobe and, of course, dressing her. And she established a sort of incredibly intricate network of suppliers of various types of materials: velvet, fur, lace, silk, satin, feathers, ribbons, and so on, as well as designers, right, who were sort of exclusively responsible for crafting her public image. And perhaps the most famous of those staff members or designers that she employed was Rose Bertin. And Rose Bertin is often credited as being the sort of first celebrity designer in France because her name was so closely associated with that of Marie Antoinette's clothing. So Rose Bertin was actually born to a working-class family in Paris in the middle of the 18th century. And she, because she had to work and ultimately never married, apprenticed herself to a milliner, a hat maker in Paris, who had intimate ties to the court at Versailles. And it's through that apprenticeship that Rose Bertin essentially sort of built her own brand and essentially established her own shop, the Grand Mogul, on the Rue Saint-Honoré in Paris, which is essentially sort of Fifth Avenue of 18th century Paris. And we know that she very much leveraged her connections to court in order to sort of finagle an introduction to Marie Antoinette, who becomes her most famous and obviously her most important client. And we know that Au Grand Mogul, which of course no longer exists, the building itself no longer exists, but we know from contemporary accounts that she lined the walls of her shop with portraits of her most famous clientele, right? So she's very much marketing herself as a celebrity designer. And so Rose Bertin and Marie Antoinette developed this friendship, this collaboration, and ultimately the two of them are in tandem responsible for some of the most outrageous and experimental looks of the 18th century. And here, before I delve into the portrait and exactly what she's wearing, I want to sort of illustrate for you the sort of shifts in fashion that occur during the course of their collaboration between the 1770s and the 1780s. So much in the same way that we, I think, in this room, could very easily identify the differences between 1970s and 1980s fashion, very different, right? The goals, the materials, the colors, the shapes, especially of women's clothing and hair, right? the same was true in the 1770s and the 1780s, right? So what we're looking at is very much an 80s look. But Rose, Bertin, and Marie Antoinette began their collaboration in the 70s, the 1770s. And it's the 70s that we associate with big, excessive volume, right? So big hair, towering wigs, enormous skirts, incredibly tiny waists. So we can't exactly see that 70s fashion here, but you can imagine, I think, these sort of incredibly restrictive corsets, this infrastructure underneath the skirts of women called panniers, which are essentially these sort of like wooden supports, right, that create this incredibly elongated hip. Very difficult to move around, right? We have all these accounts of women sort of moving and shuffling sideways to get through doorways, right? Because they're incredibly huge and voluminous. And especially, I think, most notoriously, the hair is where Marie Antoinette and Rose Bertin collaborate, where we have these incredibly towering wigs, artificial hair, which also become the kind of vehicles for decoration and ornament, right? So flowers, jewelry, sometimes entire pieces of fruit. But also, I think, more substantially, right, they begin to collaborate on a series of hair ornament which have political import or significance. Most famously, and perhaps most ironically, after the American victory over the British in the American Revolution, which of course, as you probably remember, required the participation, the assistance of the French, right, for the American victory. Most notably, French ships, right, French naval ships, of which the Americans had none. Marie Antoinette and Rose Bertin collaborate on this hairstyle, this towering wig, which is festooned with French naval ships, right, like literal models of the ships, to celebrate, of course, the French participation in the Revolution. Yes?
How exactly did they get into the States? Seems like it's very heavy, right?
Yes, that's a really great question. They had pins that are sort of like unilateral pins, right, that I think helped sort of secure things, but they also had kind of the equivalent of hairspray, right, these sort of like really thick and wet sticky pomades that would help things stay up. Yeah, quite smelly actually by contemporary accounts, which is sort of interesting, but great question. And that particular hairstyle, which I just described, was reproduced infinitely in engravings, color engravings, but also reproduced in contemporary periodicals. Most famously, the Journal des Dames, the women's journal of the 18th century, which reproduced these sort of collaborations between Rose Bertin and Marie Antoinette and distributed the fashions, right? So we see throughout Paris women mimicking what the queen is wearing. And so we very much see this celebrity developing, not only for the designer, but for Marie Antoinette herself. So Marie Antoinette didn't have very much control over how periodicals reproduced her styles. She appeared in public, they would copy them, reproduce them, and distribute them in these periodicals. But she had very little control over how she was represented in those contexts. But one area where she did have incredible control was through her portraiture. And Marie Antoinette's favorite portraitist, she was painted by many, many artists during the 18th century, and there are many, many portraits of her, but by far her favorite artist was Elizabeth Vigée-Lebrun. So I want to talk a little bit about this artist and the relationship between the two women. They actually had quite a bit in common. Vigée-Lebrun was born in Paris the same year as Marie Antoinette, so they were the same age. And they met, we think, for the first time in the late 1770s when they were both in their early 20s. And Marie Antoinette was the new Queen of France. And so they collaborate on a series of portraits beginning in the late 1770s, but it's in the 1780s that their sort of alliance is really kind of consolidated. In 1783, Marie Antoinette assists Vigée-Lebrun in becoming an official member of the French Royal Academy of Painting and Sculpture. And this is a huge deal for Vigée-Lebrun, in part because the number of female artists admitted to the Academy was limited to 4. So it's an enormous institutional body which is responsible for training artists, but it also gives them the opportunity to exhibit their work in public. So becoming a member is incredibly important for artists with a visibility. And you may be thinking, she already had the most famous client in France. Why would she want to become a member of the French Royal Academy? Why is it so important? And I think that suggests why professionally it was this incredible stamp of approval. Right, to be able to show your work publicly and to declare yourself a member of this group of the French Royal Academy. And so Marie Antoinette actually intervenes in the proceedings of the Academy and insists that her favorite portraitist become a member. Right? So we have this sort of real professional collaboration which is essential to the professional success of Vigée Lebrun. But we also know that Vigée Lebrun and Marie Antoinette collaborated very specifically on crafting a public image, knowing that these portraits were going to be on display not just in Versailles, but really for a public to consume in Paris. And so actually our portrait is based and mimics quite precisely another portrait by Vigée Lebrun, which is now at Versailles, in which Marie Antoinette is pictured with 3 of her children. So, spoiler, she did actually eventually get pregnant. they didn't. And she had 3 children, a 4th which died in infancy. And so if you can imagine this portrait in which a daughter and 2 sons are sort of clinging to their mother, right? It's this very sort of, it's an attempt to portray Marie Antoinette as this sort of more sober, maternal figure, to kind of rectify her public image. Which by this point, by the 1780s, had very much been determined by this interest in fashion, for which she was best known. So with Vigée Lebrun, she comes up with this plan to present herself as more of a kind of soft, motherly figure. Our portrait is nearly identical in dimension and the orientation of Marie Antoinette's body, but significantly, I think Vigée Lebrun changed her outfit. She's wearing a different color and a different dress in our portrait. So let's turn to the fashion itself. Right? Let's start with her head. And you can see, I think, here, a perfect example of 1780s hair. Right? Instead of this kind of fake wig, right, this sort of towering poof, as it was called in the 1770s, we see Marie Antoinette's natural hair. We see this sort of like short cropped front around her head, which has been frizzed in this really kind of poofy, elaborate way, and then sort of natural curls which are loose down her back. And then her hat, probably the most sort of elaborate and strange thing I think for us to interpret today. This particular type of hat is called a toque. It's kind of a brimless cushion made of the same blue velvet material as her dress. And you can see that it's sort of situated on top of the sheer gauzy silk, which has been sort of embroidered with gold festoons, so to speak. And then also in the very front of the toque, you can see an aigrette, which is this gem with this sort of spray of ostrich feathers kind of emerging from it. And this is a very sort of exotic, very 80s style hat, which you wouldn't have seen in the 1770s. Moving on to her dress, to us I think it looks quite voluminous, but this was in fact a much simpler, more natural silhouette than you would have seen in the 1770s. In fact, if you observe the topography of her legs and her knees emerging from the skirt itself, that's one indication that this is a sort of looser and simpler skirt because you can see the body underneath. So she's wearing this sort of white satin skirt, and over it this kind of blue velvet overcoat, which is lined with sable. And sable fur is a mammal from Russia. Actually, it's actually very cute if you Google it. But sable fur was incredibly exotic because it came from Russia, and valued because it was very soft and smooth and didn't require much sort of washing and intervention to get it to be this sort of beautiful, luxurious, soft fur. So you can see that Vigée Lebrun, while presenting Marie Antoinette in this sort of more sober, regal, dignified manner, is nonetheless paying very careful attention to the materials, which were very carefully sourced, as well as the design of the dress itself. And this is a rather intricate design. as you can see, this overcoat of blue velvet, which is secured in the front by these strips of sable fur. And underneath, you can see this sort of blousy silk white fabric emerging from underneath. And the neckline and the wrists of the dress itself, the cuffs, are this sort of delicate white lace, again, which she is treated very precisely. So Vigée Lebrun, I forgot to mention this in the beginning, her father was a painter, and he was probably her first trainer, trained her initially, but her mother was a hairdresser. So we see this acknowledgement of her mother's craft, I think, clearly. Interestingly, this particular portrait, our version of this, was commissioned by Marie Antoinette's brother-in-law, the Comte d'Artois, but Vigée Lebrun made another version of it, nearly identical. And this is something that I think makes us a little bit uncomfortable in the 21st century, but this is very common in the 18th century, that artists would produce copies of their own work, multiple different versions, especially portraits of the king and queen, which had a broad audience. But that second copy, that second version, Vigée Lebrun actually takes with her when she flees France during the French Revolution. So she essentially rolls up this canvas of the second version of the Queen and takes it with her to Italy. So this portrait and the second version were painted in 1788, only a year before the French Revolution sort of begins to take shape. So quickly, as you know, Marie Antoinette and her family are arrested at Versailles and forced to sort of quarantine themselves in the Tuileries Palace, in Paris. And then just a few years later, both she and her husband are beheaded and sent to the guillotine. And quite unceremoniously, actually, before Marie Antoinette is sent to the guillotine, her jailers cut her hair and sent her to the guillotine wearing a white nightgown. So we see this very sort of deliberate stripping of the queen's material attributes, right? That which made her feminine, that which made her queen, right? By cutting her hair, forcing her to wear this nightgown in public. Yeah, I saw a question.
How expensive was that outfit in terms of the cost?
Right. Yeah, I don't have the exact figures, but I think you're right to ask that question because that's what 18th century Parisians were asking, right? How much is the queen spending on her clothes? And why are we starving? Right? So this sort of, she becomes this kind of symbol of the luxury and excess of the monarchy, which is in such sharp contrast to the suffering of working class people. Right? So that kind of, and she was in fact spending too much. I think people agree in retrospect. But yes, that exact question, I think, is sort of at the very heart of the French Revolution. Why is she spending so much on her clothes? Yeah. But we can imagine that the materials were quite expensive. Yeah, that this imported fur from Russia, for example. Yeah. I saw another question. Yeah.
Well, one, I was just going to make the point that the jailers cut everyone's hair. It wasn't a personal attack to her. The other thing about the clothes, also of such concern to the revolution. One of the very few surviving things of hers is her wardrobe account books. So if you're interested, you could actually probably look up how much.
Right, yes. So we do have account books. Yes, I don't have them memorized, unfortunately, so I don't know the exact number. But we do, and we actually... Yes, 18th century handwriting is quite difficult to interpret, but also we do have a number of fragments of her clothing as well, which have been preserved, which I think says a little bit about the ambivalence and the kind of fraught nature of the revolution in the way it unfolds over the course of the 90s. Sorry? Just one. So there's one in the, I think, is that the Met?
It's not. It's actually bizarrely on Sleeping Beauty and Madame Tussauds.
What was the question, please?
We had a lovely informed comment about the surviving aspects of Marie Antoinette's wardrobe and her account books, which we still have to sort of document exactly how much she spent on her clothing. Another question?
Why did they force her to wear that nightgown in public?
Well, that's a great question. I think to embarrass her. It's It's embarrassing. Well, it's fun to wear your pajamas in public, I think, for us now. But in the 18th century, I think it would have been incredibly embarrassing to, especially if you're used to looking like this. Right? I think it would have been incredibly embarrassing to be ushered in front of everybody, right, wearing her nightgown. I think they did it to embarrass her before they killed her, unfortunately.
We know her age, and is her hair gray?
Two great questions. Here she's 36, and she was 37 when she dies. And yes, it was very much in fashion to powder one's hair, in addition to the sort of pomades that would keep it in place. There's these sort of powders. And it seems incredibly strange to us because we take great pains to prevent graying of our hair, I think. But yes, yeah, it was very much in fashion for both men and women. As you can see in my husband's portrait, he too is wearing a sort of powdered wig. And also very quite precisely curled, as you can see. Yeah, very particular. Right, exactly. Yeah, so still this pattern. And the powders were often scented to sort of counteract the sort of natural scent of the hair. Yeah. Great question. So about her natural hair color. And we do have early portraits of her that were commissioned, especially before she arrives in France. Her future husband kind of wanted to know what she looked like. And so we have several portraits which were commissioned of her when she's a young girl in Austria. And she seems actually kind of my hair color, like orangish, whatever, however you want. Like strawberry blonde is often how she's described. Yeah. Yeah.
Did they try to make the portraits very flattering, or is it sort of true to life? Hard to tell?
Well, it's a complicated question. Both, I think, right? Even so, other artists paint Marie Antoinette quite frequently, and when they're shown at the Salon, which is this public exhibition of French Royal Academy artists, often people critique the portraits for looking nothing like the Queen, and they really like when they seem to resemble most closely the Queen. But they also want, I think, critics of the time also really wanted to see the Queen look a certain way. They wanted to see her as a queen, right, or as a mother. These sort of preordained roles. So they're both idealized while clinging to some semblance of reality. I think was the goal.